Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Adam here. Welcome to a very special episode of Flying and Eating with way too much flying and not enough eating. Today we're going to talk about the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki specifically. How that happened, all the history, the sites that are relevant, and more.
In 1933, a full 12 years prior to the dropping of the bombs, our story would take root here in Germany as Adolf Hitler would come to power. Under Nazi rule, many Jewish scientists felt a great need to flee to the United States, where they would end up teaching at universities and oppose the German government in exile. In 1938, German scientists that remained had managed to successfully split the atom. It took very little time before the exiled German scientists in the United States realized the potential of creating a bomb with such technology, and genuinely feared what Adolf Hitler would do with it. One scientist in particular, Leo Szilard, was mortified by this prospect and wanted to warn President Franklin Roosevelt about this. Lacking credibility, though, he managed to arrange for Albert Einstein to get his letter through. In response, Roosevelt created the Advisory Committee on Uranium, but at this point it was October of 1939 and Europe was at war. Thus, the committee was something of a low priority.
It was at this time Italian scientist Enrico Fermi would escape fascist Italy and make his way to the United States. While he understood that a bomb was hypothetically possible, he wanted to prove that it could actually be done.
Shortly after this, it became public knowledge that the Germans were now attempting to produce a bomb with this technology.
And then it happened. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, here behind me, as well as the American territories of Lake, Guam, and the Philippines, which were part of the U.S. at the time. After these incidents, the United States and its military capacity, represented here by the Pentagon behind me, was drawn into a full-scale war with the Empire of Japan, along with fascist Italy and, of course, Nazi Germany. Roosevelt's interest in an atomic bomb plan would become significantly increased. He would completely authorize the weapons program and hand it over to the military to make into a reality. The new initiative was to be headed by General Leslie Groves. It was named the Manhattan Project due to its origin in New York. It was a plan Groves resented and didn't believe in. He had just completed the creation of the Pentagon and felt this whole thing was beneath him. Guaranteed, though, he never thought he'd be played by Matt Damon one day.
On December 2nd, 1942, Enrico Fermi and his team here at the University of Chicago proved for the first time that a nuclear fission reaction could be released in a controlled way, rendering proof it was possible to make a bomb.
On December 28, 1942, President Roosevelt authorized a budget for General Groves for the creation of a new facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico to be built for the purposes of creating and testing the bomb. This was done by buying up land under false pretenses so as to avoid arousing suspicion. Groves would also, rather famously, task one J. Robert Oppenheimer with being the head of the project. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a professor of theoretical physics at the University of California in Berkeley, recruited by General Groves as a scientific lead for the Manhattan Project. A man of incredible brilliance and inevitable accomplishment, but we'll talk more about his legacy later. Oppenheimer, who once lived in this house, would be responsible for running the facility. He recruited scientists from all over the country to work with, some with questionable allegiance to the United States, which would eventually come back to haunt them. However, Oppenheimer rarely cared about such things. He wanted who was best for getting the task at hand accomplished.
In order for the bomb to work, a substance called uranium-235 would be required. However, this doesn't exist purely in nature, but in small amounts with the much more common uranium-238. To generate this, a gigantic facility called Y-12 in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, here behind me, was constructed to create the gigantic apparatus necessary to separate the essential uranium-235 isotopes away from those that were unnecessary in uranium-238. The facility was given only 6 months to get built, get online, and deliver their payload. Oppenheimer requested 200 kilograms, roughly 440 pounds, to be created. However, he'd never get anywhere near this amount, nor would I get anywhere near this facility because you have to actually work here to get inside. This type of uranium bomb, sometimes called the gun bomb, would operate by essentially internally firing one component inside the bomb at another. Once hit, it would explode and cause a chain reaction leading to an atomic explosion. The facility began construction in February of 1943. Groves, seeing these quotas as unrealistic, decided to make more facilities to generate more materials such as plutonium, an alternative radioactive substance in the event sufficient uranium-235 couldn't be made. A site in Hanford, Washington was constructed for this purpose. The facility took a while to make plutonium of sufficient quality and left behind a lot of nuclear waste. Eventually, Hanford had to be shut down, and to this day is still dealing with a nuclear cleanup process not expected to be completed until the 2040s. Fittingly, nearly a century after it was first built. And today, this is as far as the public can access. A second facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee called K-25 was built. K-25 at the time was the biggest building in the world in terms of square footage. Its purpose was to make more uranium-235 as quickly as possible.
In early 1944, it became clear that it may not be feasible to generate enough of either substance due to a laundry list of problems. So Oppenheimer and his team decided to reevaluate their designs, hoping to require less of each substance. By the end of 1944, they believed they could make one bomb using uranium-235 and two using plutonium. The order came down that it was essential that they prove they could make it work. The plutonium bomb used an implosion tactic, as plutonium cannot reach critical mass in atmospheric conditions. A conventional bomb was used to pressurize the plutonium, allowing for atoms to cluster and cascade in nuclear fission. In essence, they had found two different ways to create a nuclear bomb.
In February of 1945, Oppenheimer's team completed the single uranium-235 bomb and named it Little Boy due to its relatively small size. While many wished to test this bomb, doing so would be impossible as they lacked sufficient materials to make a second. On the other hand, the plutonium-based bombs were completed in March of 1945 and scheduled for a test in July. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would suddenly collapse from a cerebral hemorrhage. After that, he would die, taking with him his knowledge and intentions for use of these bombs. All the same, his Vice President Harry Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States.
Due to the intense secrecy of the Manhattan Project, even as Vice President, Harry Truman hadn't been informed of its existence. He was told in extensive detail what had been going on in his first week on the job as president.
On April 30th, 1945, below me in the former Führer bunker, one Adolf Hitler took his own life. Once he was dead, his body was brought up here, placed right there, and set on fire, his ashes scattered to history.
On May 8th, 1945, German forces unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. While this was an obvious reason to celebrate, it now meant the primary reason the atomic bomb had been under construction was no longer relevant. And as it turns out, the Germans had never even been close to completing an operational weapon. While Italy and Germany had ended their war, Japan, represented here by the Imperial Palace behind me, decided to continue on in their war in what was clearly an unwinnable endeavor. The U.S. effort to push the Japanese forces out of the Pacific had proven very successful, but very costly. The Battle of Okinawa had concluded on June 22, 1945, at the cost of 50,000 American lives. In that same time frame, the U.S. moved a man named Paul Tibbets and his unit to an island formerly held by Japan and used it for the invasion of Guam in 1941, called Tinian, right here behind me. They would construct the largest airport in the world at the time to house Boeing B-29 Superfortresses. Tibbets had been very experienced in aviation, having also largely participated in combat operations in Europe. His new goal was to train his pilots to get familiar with using Tinian Island to conduct bombing raids on Japan's home islands.
On the morning of July 16, 1945, in White Sands, New Mexico, about 200 miles south of Los Alamos, the world changed forever. Oppenheimer dubbed the test Trinity. Anxiety ran high among the scientists. This first bomb was, well, the first. It was best thought of as a prototype, a proof of concept. It was called a gadget rather than a weapon, scientists claiming that even if they built a second one exactly like it, it would have been impossible to use it in warfare. They had no idea what was going to happen when they set it off. They didn't even know if they had built it right. It actually wasn't impossible from a scientific standpoint that the explosion could set the atmosphere on fire and destroy the entire planet. They simply didn't know. But at 5:30 a.m., the world successfully entered the nuclear age with the first detonation of an atomic weapon in human history.
After the success of the Trinity Test, the decision was made to move the two remaining bombs to Tinian Island for use on Japan in the event Truman gave the go-ahead. While many targets were considered, the Americans wisely crossed Tokyo and Kyoto off the list. Kyoto, which is behind me, was known to be a spiritual city to the Japanese, largely ignored as a target during the war. It was believed the destruction of it would have been so egregious to the Japanese that they'd have fought to the last man, while the annihilation of Tokyo would have also meant the death of the emperor, and resulted in the same outcome. On the flip side, though, it meant that the U.S. had intentionally avoided bombing certain cities with the aim of seeing the full destructive capacity of the bomb. A morbid thought.
The U.S. was now faced with a difficult decision, to use the bombs or not. Almost every scientist that had worked on it wished to demonstrate to the Japanese on an uninhabited island, showing them what was coming for them if they didn't surrender, while hardliners simply saw it as more of a wonder weapon gifted to them to end the war swiftly.
At the time, the estimates based on the results of the battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, or even here on Saipan, meant the United States expected an invasion of Japan to take years and likely cost the lives of up to 1 million American troops, not to mention the money and material necessary for such an effort. This says nothing of the countless lives of Japanese that would die. Based on the American experience of liberating islands, they became all too aware that the Japanese had discouraged people from surrendering to the Americans under the false pretenses the U.S. would violently harm them, much as the Japanese had done to the natives of most places. This proved to be false, of course, but it did mean they had to factor in countless civilian deaths. Leaflets to this effect had been scattered all across Japan, including here in Osaka by the United States, warning civilians of bombing raids and to leave the cities, surrender immediately, sea or face national destruction, and so on. These threats were often taken seriously by the Japanese population, but the Japanese government made possession or knowledge of them illegal. In other words, the Japanese government forced their people to continue to endure this for no reason other than pride. It must be said that the Japanese weren't stupid. They knew all of this. But setting aside their cultural reasons for not wanting to surrender to an enemy for the first time in their 1,000-plus year history, they also feared for what would come next. How would the Americans treat them after what they had done? How would the emperor be treated? Would his corpse be paraded around like Mussolini? Would he become ashes like Hitler? The emperor was considered a living god, not a mere politician. Despite this, though, he had little real power and was often treated as a child, where things were simply done in his name by those who believed they knew what was best for him.
The Japanese strategy became bleed the Americans out, make them hurt as much as possible, including things like the kamikaze suicide bomber planes. These actions, the Japanese believed, would force the Americans to the negotiation table and get Japan a better deal for terms to the end of hostilities. Needless to say, this misunderstanding of the Americans is what caused them to believe the attack on Pearl Harbor would scare the U.S. into submission. Essentially, they hadn't learned anything from their own failures.
The Americans had just become so sick of a war they never wanted anything to do with. And these people who started this, refusing to accept the reality of their situation. They had no remaining air force, no remaining navy, no remaining allies, no industrial capacity to generate a reasonable defense, and they had been barbaric to U.S. forces and everyone they had invaded. Despite having absolutely no chance of winning, they insisted on this absurd notion of carrying on until the very end as they saw it.
Another layer of complexity to add to this was the geopolitical events unfolding in Europe, particularly in London. The marriage of convenience with the Soviet Union and the other Allied powers was coming back to haunt them. Joseph Stalin became increasingly belligerent and more demanding. For example, he insisted he retain the eastern portions of Germany and everything east of that point, including Poland, which was the original reason the war had even started. This became so bad that Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom asked his Ministry of War to calculate what it would take for the British Empire to repel Soviet forces out of Europe. Their response came back to the effect, without the Americans, we shouldn't hope to have any chance of such an outcome.
Remember that entering the war, the United States was an isolationist-minded nation with no interest in being involved in such affairs, certainly no interest in constantly cleaning up after European wars. This meant that there was no chance the United States would suddenly attack the Soviet Union to help the British, though as history would later conclude, if there had ever been a time to do so, this would have been it. Anyway, often forgotten that while the lion's share of the war in the Pacific against the Japanese was fought by the Americans, the British and French did have territorial possessions there at that time. In fact, this became worth noting as the British, per the rules of the Quebec Agreement between the US and UK governments, had the ability to block the Americans from using the atomic bombs. However, they authorized the use of them before they were dropped. To have any chance of retaining all, some, or even any of their Asian colonial possessions, such as Hong Kong here behind me, the British and French would have to cooperate and engage in Pacific warfare goals. To this end, the three allies had convinced the Soviet Union to join the war effort against Japan 3 months after the surrender of Germany. Well, that time was rapidly approaching, and the Allies were beginning to have buyer's remorse. They didn't want to have to think about the geopolitical nightmare the Soviet Union, represented here by the Russian embassy in Berlin behind me, would attempt to create in Japan as they had done in Germany, and were soon to do in the Korean Peninsula. In other words, the Allies didn't want there to be a communist North and democratic southern Japan. Truman, sick of Stalin's attitude, went to him at the Potsdam Conference here behind me with the atomic bomb, hoping to use it to leverage him, scare him, and force him to back down. It is from this very location that President Harry Truman made the decision to proceed with use of nuclear weapons. Reportedly, when Truman informed Stalin of the weapon and their intentions, Stalin said something to the simple effect of, "Good luck." Truman was taken aback a bit by the casual nature of the response, to the point where he wondered if Stalin even understood what he was talking about. Later he learned why. Oppenheimer's blasé attitude towards security and who he had trusted on the job led to a lot of spies sending sensitive information back to the Soviet Union. They were very aware of the project and would even have their own bomb in 1949. Regardless of those newly forming tensions, the Allies still had a mission to accomplish. On July 26, 1945, they sent the Japanese what was known as the Potsdam Declaration. It was effectively an ultimatum for the terms of surrender that warned of the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably, the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland. The atomic bombs themselves weren't mentioned. They awaited a reply that would never come. The Enola Gay, named after the mother of Paul Tibbets, was a B-29 bomber selected for the mission. Tibbets knew the plane would become famous, and he wanted to be sure no other plane would ever be confused for it, so he gave it as unique a name as he could. Several last-minute attempts to convince Truman to not use the bomb were made, but he ultimately made the decision to give the go-ahead on July 31st, 1945. He was insistent that the Japanese needed a shock to leadership, meaning he had hoped this would scare the Japanese into accepting their reality. Some evidence suggests Truman may have made the decision as early as 2 months prior when it was still unproven technology. If it had become public knowledge this wonder weapon existed and Truman had chosen not to use it, instead of choosing to sacrifice countless American lives in a conventional war, he would have been impeached to say the very least.
Here on Tinian at the remains of Assembly Building Number 1 on August 5th, 1945, right there, the Hiroshima-intended little boy bomb was completed.
After being fueled, prepped, and loaded here on Tinian at 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945,
Paul Tibbets takes the Enola Gay, drives it down here, brings it around here, over to where that car is, turns into the same direction as that car, does final checks, and then takes off on this runway.
in 6.5 hours, it would reach the Japanese mainland. Tibbets and his crew each had a specific job. Some would plot their course, some would operate communications, while others had to arm the first nuclear bomb used in warfare in human history. Tom Farabee had the unfortunate task of finding a spot to drop and release the bomb once overhead. It is now August 6, 1945 at 8:12 a.m. Sirens blared out. American aircraft were spotted. People were encouraged to take cover. This had become routine. By this point in the war, firebombing raids were a regular occurrence. The Japanese defense forces were all but obliterated. All they could meaningfully do was tell people to hide. But there was no hiding from what was about to happen. 3 minutes after they arrived, Mr. Farabee found what he saw to be the city center and dropped the prototype bomb, known as Little Boy, out of the belly of the Enola Gay from a height of 31,000 feet. The Enola Gay then turned to exit Japan as quickly as possible.
Over the skies of Hiroshima fell a single ominous object. It was meant to fall and hit here at the Aoi Bridge behind me, but due to the winds, it was now over the Shima Surgical Clinic. It fell and fell for a hauntingly long 43 seconds. The feeling of anxiety was so intense that the assumption was the bomb had failed to detonate. However, at 8:16 a.m. at a predetermined height of 2,000 feet, the bomb exploded.
The crew of the Enola Gay was nearly 12 miles away at the time of detonation, and yet they were blinded by the explosion. The shockwaves required Tibbets to execute corrective maneuvers to keep the plane in the air. The crew went into stunned and shocked silence, attempting to take photos and film. The only comment they managed to get out was, "My God, what have we done?" This was the first time in world history a uranium bomb had been detonated, and the first ever in the history of warfare. Behind me is the exact spot in Hiroshima where the bomb detonated. 90% of the city was destroyed almost instantly by the shock of the blast. The intensity was so significant that the skin of people standing 2 miles away was charred. About 5 square miles and roughly 70% of all buildings were wiped out in an instant. The exact death toll remains unknown, but is believed to range from 70 to 80,000 people that were wiped out almost instantly. As gruesome a thought as it is, one of the many reasons accurate numbers are almost impossible is because so many people were vaporized with simply no remaining trace of their existence. This says nothing of the additional deaths that would occur from radiation poisoning over the next few weeks, bringing the total up to perhaps as high as 140,000, not including the tens of thousands of additional people who sustained injuries forced to live in the aftermath. At this time, very few Japanese doctors were left to be able to take care of the injured, and those that were available had no way to explain the radiation symptoms they were now dealing with, as it was an entirely new thing in the collective human experience. I suggest only those with the strongest of stomachs and bravest of emotional constitutions bear witness to the full footage of the wounded from that day, as no amount of preparation can adequately make anyone able to handle it without getting mortified or highly emotional. For visual measurement, the bomb exploded at a height only slightly above that of the Sears Tower here in Chicago, and yes, it's Sears, not Willis. It must be explained that the bomb detonating 2,000 feet in the air had some significant consequences. There are 4 types of nuclear explosions: a high-altitude burst, such as one in space, an air burst, where the explosion happens in midair but the fireball doesn't touch the ground, a surface blast, where the explosion kicks off on the surface and throws material from the soil into the air, and finally a subsurface burst, where the bomb is buried and detonated underground.
The explosion in Hiroshima was an airburst. This meant that the explosive forces of the bomb were dispersed into the air in all directions. The only parts that would hit the city was a fraction of the power that shot down to the surface. This means far less of the city was destroyed than otherwise could have been. It's for this reason the iconic Genbaku, or A-bomb dome, has survived. The other significance of an airburst was that it meant that the radiation would dissipate in about 24 hours. This is something not nearly talked about enough. The common belief with something like this is that the site should undoubtedly still be radioactive, but it isn't. What is the reason for that? Basically, a surface detonation is by far more deadly, as radioactive materials will cling to surface components such as dirt and debris, rendering them radioactive. This is in effect what happened at Chernobyl in 1986. The detonation occurring at the height in which it did means the majority of radioactive particles had nothing to cling to and thus would decay before reaching the ground, thus posing no long-term radioactivity. As uncomfortable as it may be to admit to ourselves, all the radioactivity that was exposed to the site, all the sickening impacts it had, was caused by no more than 60 seconds of existence. It is horrifying to think, though, had the bomb time malfunctioned and impacted on the surface and then detonated, Where we stand today would probably seem more like Chernobyl than the vibrant city that it is.
So I remind you, by looking up here atop Chicago's Sears Tower, exploding at this altitude, 60 seconds of radiation. Exploding down there at the surface, 30 to 50 years of being inhospitable to human life from a best guess. That's all the distance it took. Remember that.
At 2:58 p.m. on Tinian, the Enola Gay touched down. The crew were celebrated as heroes for their actions. While they externally portrayed the attitude expected of them, privately they were mortified by what had happened. Meanwhile, on August 7th, a Japanese scientist named Yoshio Nichina flew from Tokyo to Hiroshima to verify the rumors that a nuclear bomb, something considered at best hypothetical to them, had actually been achieved. He confirmed to his government what had occurred. The Japanese war cabinet began to accept their situation. They had hoped the Soviet Union might be willing to step in and mediate a deal, but in the meantime, they would continue the war. This information was made clear to the Americans through intercepted codes.
Later that day, Harry Truman, who had been informed of Japan's decision to fight on, would make the speech that would largely define his presidency as he explained that the bomb had been used on Hiroshima, which he described as a military base. In his defense, the city largely was a base at the time, and to his credit, he declared that the decision to use the weapon was his and his alone, assuming full responsibility for it. He was, however, also prepared to continue to use the bomb, implying the existence of many more until Japan ultimately surrendered.
On August 8, 1945, two extremely significant things happened. The Soviet Union declared war on the Empire of Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, though technically this invasion began on August 9th in Japanese time. The long and short of the Russian involvement here is that they would break the back of Japan's military capacity abroad. They don't get enough credit for this. However, fears of Stalin's desire to simply conquer these territories were correct. At war's end, the Soviet Union and now modern Russia would retain this territory, along with what is today referred to as the Kuril Islands. Japan, to this day, does not recognize Russia's right to possess these islands, and as a result, a peace agreement between the two nations was never signed, effectively and technically meaning that World War II between these two never actually ended. However, with this action, the Japanese recognized they had no hope of a mediator stepping in to negotiate on their behalf.
The other significant activity was when President Truman gave authorization to proceed with the second bombing run. It was now something of a race to get the Japanese to surrender as quickly as possible before the Soviets could gobble up more Japanese territory. For this reason, the second bombing was pushed up from August 11th to August 9th. Incidentally, this fear was completely justified. With the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, we were given the roots of the divide between North and South Korea, a problem that persists to this day.
In preparation to comply with Truman's orders, a different aircraft was selected over the Enola Gay. The boxcar had been intended originally to provide support, while an aircraft called the Great Artiste was meant to drop the bomb. However, the expedited timetable made this unfeasible.
The Fat Man plutonium bomb, the second ever of its kind, was loaded onto the aircraft. After doing so, shortly before takeoff, a problem was noticed with the fuel pump. It meant the plane would be required to carry more fuel as it would be burning it faster. Changing the bomb to another aircraft or replacing the pump was not possible given the time constraints. This would have a rather significant impact on the events to follow. At 3:47 a.m., the boxcar would take off from Tinian Island and head to Japan, with the Fat Man inside the belly of the aircraft.
What is often not discussed much is the target of this raid actually wasn't intended to be Nagasaki. It was the city of Kokura, seen here behind me, one of the few active military arsenal hubs left in Japan. Nagasaki was considered a fallback plan in the event of issues.
The Enola Gay, despite becoming infamous only a couple days prior, actually did play a role in the second bombing. It was a weather scout ship sent to Kokura and Nagasaki to report findings back to the boxcar.
While the boxcar was waiting for the Enola Gay's report, it had to repeatedly circle with a damaged fuel pump, causing them to run lower on fuel than they were comfortable with. All the same, they decided to proceed to Kokura.
Ironically, weather helped to push smoke from the American fire bombings the day before over Kokura. The fires were still burning, and the smoky conditions made finding a specific target in Kokura nearly impossible. The boxcar attempted 3 runs to find their target. However, being there so long meant that the Japanese defense forces were able to start shooting at the aircraft. With low fuel and little time, the boxcar was forced to head to its secondary target. For the city of Kokura, the phrase "Kokura's luck" emerged. It is the only city in the history of the world that someone deliberately attempted to drop a nuclear weapon on that ultimately was not hit.
Not feeling particularly lucky at this point, the crew of the boxcar recognized they wouldn't get many chances to hit a target in Nagasaki. If they were unable to strike, they would ultimately have to head towards Okinawa with the bomb in hand and release it into the ocean. The reduced weight load was their only chance of making it back to Tinian safely.
At around 10:45 a.m., the Great Artiste, a different B-29 superfortress, flew over Nagasaki, here behind me, dropping leaflets aimed at Japanese physicist Professor Sagane, pleading with him to convince the public and his government of the severity of nuclear weapons, and that the U.S. would continue to do this until the surrender of Japan.
It was now 10:55 a.m., and the crew of the boxcar flew over the city of Nagasaki. Due to poor visibility conditions, the mission was nearly terminated, but suddenly there was a break in the clouds, and the decision was made to release Fat Man at 10:58 a.m. Once released, boxcar immediately headed away towards Tinian.
The bomb would fall for about 45 seconds before detonating at about 1,600 feet over a mile and a half away from the intended target, right here behind me. This meant that the blast was largely contained to the Urakami Valley, with major portions of the city that would be spared as a result. However, roughly 45% of it was still obliterated, with estimates of 40,000 to 75,000 people killed instantly, though thousands more would die from injuries and radiation poisoning. It must be repeated that the technology of each bomb dropped on Japan was fundamentally different. Plutonium bombs yielded a far bigger explosion. As a result, the Nagasaki bomb, especially if it had hit its original target, would have been far, far worse than it ultimately was. Like Little Boy, the bomb was an airburst, so most radioactivity would quickly decay. While the boxcar was in flight headed back to Tinian, the Big Six of the Japanese government met to discuss their situation. It is worth noting that what brought them together was not the Nagasaki bombing, or even the Hiroshima bombing, though that was made plainly clear to them. It was actually the Soviet invasion. They would spend the day arguing about the option of surrender. During this meeting, they would be interrupted and informed of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. They would conclude with no decision made. 3 were in favor of surrender, 3 wanted to continue the war, but were open to surrender with substantial conditions, such as no occupation, no returning of territory, and no war trials. Prime Minister Suzuki would do the unthinkable and request Emperor Hirohito to break the tie. After hearing arguments of both sides, Hirohito decided he wished to inform the Allies they would accept the Potsdam Declaration with the sole condition that the imperial system be allowed to survive. On August 14th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito, who is buried here behind me, recorded a speech to the Japanese public, set to be broadcast the following day, that stated Japan was to surrender and comply with the Americans. There was an attempted and thankfully failed coup on the part of several Japanese officers to destroy the recording and kill the emperor so that the war may press on. But that's a story for a different time. Despite this, on August 15th, Japan would surrender to Allied forces with a formal ceremony on September 2nd, 1945. The war was over. The post-war recovery story of the American and Japanese cooperation is a wonderful and uplifting story, but not one for today. All that must be said is that Emperor Hirohito, in conjunction with American General Douglas MacArthur, represented here behind me, set in motion the foundation not only for healing, but for prosperity and genuine friendship to be formed between these two great nations and peoples. Looking back to J. Robert Oppenheimer, who once lived in this house, who was no doubt one of the most enigmatic and infamous figures in American and possibly world history, often referred to as the father of the atomic bomb, a legacy he wouldn't get away from ultimately. Famously, after the bomb was made, he would say, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His desire to be forgotten was so high that his ashes were scattered on this beach named after him in the U.S. Virgin Islands on the island of St. John. Maybe something he thought he would ultimately do to humanity. The question always comes up, was it right or wrong to use the bombs? This is a debate that hasn't stopped since the inception of their creation. Worth reminding is the simple reality that the full radioactive effects of the weapons were simply not understood at the time of their use. The nuclear weapon itself as a concept is paradoxical in its nature. Humanity gave itself the power to destroy itself, while simultaneously the fear of doing so has prevented us from even more wars. While I can't tell you what was or wasn't the right decision, there was one post-war conversation I'd like to mention as food for thought. In 1959, Paul Tibbets, the man who flew the Enola Gay to Hiroshima, met with Mitsuo Fua, the captain that led the first wave of aircraft at Pearl Harbor. Tibbets told him, "You really did surprise us at Pearl Harbor, you know."
Fuchida responded, "What do you think you did to us at Hiroshima? You did the right thing. You know the Japanese attitude at the time, how fanatic they were. They'd die for the emperor. Every man, woman, and child would have resisted that invasion with sticks and stones if necessary. Can you imagine what a slaughter it would have been to invade Japan? It would have been terrible. The Japanese people know more about that than the American public will ever know."
Ultimately, the cases both for and against these actions can be made by anyone, with a wide ranging of opinions on how things may or may not have gone. The truth is, we will never know. All we do know is how it played out. Personally, I want our world to learn from this experience and hope never to repeat it. As of now, and hopefully forever, the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945 is the last nuclear weapon ever used in warfare. And to that end, this peace park and this monument was built in Nagasaki, Japan. Japan today is a thriving global economy and beacon of hope, freedom, and culture to the world. While they do not embrace their imperial past, they certainly haven't forgotten the sins of it. They are heavily aligned with the United States, who they now permit to remain on their territory to not only help with their own security, but to further forge greater cooperation, friendship, and economic benefits between the two great countries. In spite of the horrifying loss of life that was incurred by the decisions to utilize the atomic bombs, the effort to maintain peace and stability, even among what was once the most bitter of enemies, brings us hope for a sustained tomorrow.
Just as a bonus to wrap this video up, behind me, of course, you see the atomic bomb pit where the little boy bomb came from, where the Enola Gay took off from and all that, and as I've shown before. Turns out this is also where the Fat Man bomb came from. The second bomb pit that claims to be where the Fat Man bomb came from is actually inaccurate. That, according to Don Farrell, who is an author on the subject, he says that it's been wrong ever since they built the plaques here in 1985, and they've been trying with the Parks Department to correct it, but things kind of move slowly out here. So hopefully this does get corrected, because both atomic bombs launched from this exact same pit.
And that'll do it for what has probably been the most ambitious video I've ever made. Hope you guys enjoyed this. This was about a year of work going to all these places, and as you can tell, I really did do that. I have to give a bunch of huge shout-outs here to various people that helped me with this, most notably my boy Sunshine. He really joined me on a lot of these adventures to get this stuff done. There was also Nate Walker helped me with a good chunk of it. There was Candace, aka Virtual Girl, who took me to some places. But yeah, no, and my buddy Glenn on Saipan. Like, really, this was a ton of effort, ton of work. It's great to make, and I hope you guys really enjoyed the final product. Please, if you like this, share it. Let people know about it, because, again, this is voting with your wallet time, man. You want more videos like this? The people need to know this kind of thing has to be successful. So anyway, if you guys can do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before. Check out all my social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, etc. And, of course, share this video around. Let people know about it. Please do so. And if you want to consider donating, I'll even put a PayPal link and stuff like that. Venmo link as well in the description. I appreciate the support. And I also want to give one last shout out here to Don Farrell, who really provided a lot of great information and insight into the events that had transpired on August 6th, 1945. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all later.